All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our our Wisdom Wednesday webinar. This is, I believe, the third or fourth installment in our series. And just so you all know, the format of this session is a lot more interactive than a traditional webinar. So the point here is that I'm joined by our special guest, Brett Knowles, who I'll introduce in a moment. And we take a topic, today's topic being how far ahead should you look with OKRs? And we invite you all to join the discussion. We have some ideas we want to kick back and forth and debate a little bit, but by means of the chat feature here in Zoom, or by raising your hand and joining the conversation, we would love for you to be part of that discussion. Right, so, if you don't mind advancing the slide here. Just by way of brief introduction, my name is Reed Coster. I'm the OKR practice lead with our services team here at BetterWorks. So I work with organizations as they're designing their programs and rolling out OKRs to their organization. And I'm joined by Brett Knowles, who's the founder and leader of PM2 Consulting. So Brett, if you want to say a quick word.
Sure. PM Squared's a boutique firm that specializes in implementing OKRs. And to this conversation, we're bringing our experience with 3,000 or 4,000 organizations from around the world in all different sectors. And so we just want to bring some pragmatic, field-based experience to this conversation.
Yeah. Sorry, Brett. So PM Squared, my apologies for mispronouncing. And, Brett and I have had a lot of conversations about OKRs. One thing we like about discussing OKRs is we have similar instincts, but a lot of times different levels of experience with OKRs in an organization, right? So Brett is really locked in with an executive team as they're discussing fitting OKR planning into their strategy processes, right? And working very closely with those personas. Well, I'll work with those groups as well. The goal of BetterWorks is to be able to take OKRs and implement them throughout the organization, right, in a process that works at scale over time, right? So when we have a topic like today's, hopefully we can get the point of view of what it really means when we're talking about that executive experience, but then also, well, what's the reality of making this work across a large and complex organization? All right, so with that, Brett, we're officially on the hot seat, you and I. So I have some questions that maybe I'll start off by asking, and we can go back and forth. But then I'll remind folks that at any point, if you want to use the chat or the Q&A feature, we'll be monitoring those. And if you raise your hand in the attendee view, we can call on you if you want to join the conversation. So, Brett, I'm going to just start with the basics here. Our topic is about looking ahead with OKRs, cadence of OKRs. So in simplest terms, what is the best practice for OKR cadence within an organization? What's our starting point?
Best practice, that's intriguing. Hey, just before we get into that, though, I wanted to congratulate you and the BetterWorks team for a pretty awesome goal summit last week. That was
Thank you.
A great presentation. I think you had like 400 people read in your session, which is a bit like spinning a lot of plates at the same time.
Thanks, Brett. I appreciate it. Yeah, I hope some of those folks from Goal Summit are attending today too, so we can answer some questions that weren't answered on the day.
Sure. Well, so, the question at hand, I would start off by saying, I think in terms of cadence, I would start off by saying time is elastic. I'm not sure Einstein would agree with me, but, the issue is this. I can remember when I started strategy consulting back in 1982, we used to create 5-year plans for clients. I can't imagine doing a 5-year plan anymore. The uncertainty that we used to have out 5 years, we now have out 1 year. In other words, my old 5-year plan is now my 1-year plan. That means my old 1-year plan is now my 1/4 plan. In other words, the pace of business has increased and the cadence is different than it was. Now, part of the problem is many business processes haven't changed. We still do an annual strategy planning. We do annual financial budgets and so on. And so the reality of the world has not been mirrored by how we manage businesses. But in terms of being elastic, usually this is a tough concept for me to get across, but luckily, due to COVID-19, we have a really good case example where in John Doerr's book, he says we should revisit our strategy once a quarter. In other words, just with the passage of time, and that cadence is quarterly, we should take a look at it, because just, it's like watching paint dry. Small things change that you don't notice. But with the issue with COVID, it puts in a different, I'm going to say, a tripwire that, if you think of the OKRs you had in January, come March, all of a sudden they're gone because I'm in survival mode. And then in April, where we begin to establish what people call the new normal, we figured out how to work remotely, the tempo of business began to pick up and so on. You kind of have to do your OKRs over again. But it's not conveniently at the end of a quarter. Now it's in the middle of the quarter. And then in June, when we move on to the next norm.
Yeah, and I know you've written extensively about OKRs and COVID, and I think that's an interesting topic to get on here in a second. I would say that just like as a starting point, though, I think probably if anyone were to research OKRs on their own, the vast majority of literature would say, right, here's the standard template if you're getting started, which is consider annual OKRs at the top company with quarterly OKRs beneath. And again, it's a best practice. What Brett and I are going to dive into is the areas where that's not the rule across the board. But what's useful to know about why that's the starting point is OKRs, when they were first born of Andy Grove's teachings, were thought to be a way to take what was an annual set of goals, these MBOs that existed in his organization, and make them something that was actionable and part of the work of everyone in the organization. And so he devised this idea that a quarterly cadence, or in some cases a monthly cadence within that, was the way to take something that really existed as something that was an artifact. It represented strategy more than it represented action towards the strategy. And he came up with this quarterly cadence. And so I think that's why that's commonly known as the starting point. But yeah, we're going to get into all the little edge cases where maybe that doesn't work, how organizations are doing this creatively, where competing departments have different uses for OKRs. Yeah, so I just wanted to call that out. Annual at the top and quarterly underneath is probably the most common story you're going to hear about OKRs if you do your research.
Yeah, and I'm kind of saying, be careful. The answer is different. The answer is different
for sure.
In a crisis mode. It's like an accordion where a quarter used to be long enough, but when times
exactly.
get tough, all of a sudden things compress and I need more frequent. And then when things stabilize, they go longer again. And so I think that's one issue that reflects on that quarterly conversation.
For sure. No, that's a great point. And that was one of the more interesting conversations we were having with a lot of organizations earlier this year, which is how do OKRs adapt in a crisis? And to your point, Brett, they have to be elastic. The whole point is that they reflect the reality of the business, and that's why they're useful. And so you could say they're reacting to the crisis. The way they react is that we're changing our guidelines. OKRs need to be set and reset or reviewed once a month as opposed to once a quarter, if that was your cadence before, right? Right? Or we have different rules about how often we talk about what still exists as a quarterly OKR.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I reflect on that, I begin to think of tripwires. So set a KR, a key result that if you hit a certain level, it's going to trigger us to have a strategy refresh. And so let's talk about the difference between KPIs and key results for a second. A KPI isn't necessarily linked to a strategic objective. I'll give you a simple example. The check engine light in your car, right? If you're driving along and that check engine light goes on, you're supposed to pull over and call a mechanic and so forth. But if you're going to the hospital in an emergency and the check engine light goes on, you ignore it. In other words, the only way I can interpret the data, the KPI, is if I understand the strategy. And one of the key differentiators of an OKR versus a key result versus a KPI, there are many differences, but one of the key ones we found is we link that indicator, the KPI, to an objective, that becomes a key result. Now, where that plays into this conversation is now as a tripwire. If that, let's say it's the, whatever it is, then we had one client where their servers were overburdened. As the workers began working remotely, their servers couldn't handle the volume. Well, as soon as you get to that system down issues hitting that trigger point, we better rethink our strategy. Now, in their case, what it was they just had the employees work before 10 o'clock in the morning or after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that servers were available for customers in prime business hours. So the key result, because it's linked to an objective, you hit the tripwire and it allows you to make an informed decision about how to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And that's touching on, I don't know if you saw the question come in here, Brett, from our guest, but explaining the difference between OKR and KPI, which actually we spent the previous Wisdom Wednesday discussing. If you consider maybe management of KPIs as a separate process from OKRs, where a KPI could be a key result for an objective, do you see them working together in different parts of the business? Maybe we can give a quick answer to this question.
To me, it's almost a drill down. So the KPIs are the details. So again, if I go back to that check engine light metaphor, the key result is a check engine light. But if your mechanic wants to know what's going on with the car, they don't double click the check engine light. They put a bunch of diagnostic equipment on the engine to measure 23 other things. Those KPIs are the 23 other things, right? So the key result hits that threshold. It says, gosh, of all the things in the business, this is the one we should pay attention to. Now you can use that data-rich environment, those KPIs to research and diagnose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I want to get back to the how far ahead question for a minute, which is, if we start with this idea of we want to prescribe a general cadence for the organization, and then if we have a starting point of annual at the top, quarterly below, is there a scenario where you can have different cadences within different groups? Right. So instead of it just being a blanket rule like that, can it be different for different parts of the organization?
Right. I think my answer would be yes. And there's two key dimensions to that. One is how senior you are in the organization. Right. The simple model is the more senior you are in the organization, the farther out in time you look. So the executives are looking at 1 to 5 years. The VPs are looking at 1 to 5 quarters. The operational people, 1 to 5 months. Eventually I get to the person at the call center or the drive-through window or the programmer. They're looking at 1 to 5 minutes or 1 to 5 days. So the cadences change as you go down, and the granularity of the data, the key results change. So level of the organization's read, I would suggest, is one. The second is different departments work at different paces. So again, we all know of IT departments that have, daily stand-up meetings because their pace is like this. Now, marketing people don't take this the wrong way, but I'm suggesting marketing might meet once a fortnight, and it's still frequent enough for the drumbeat of that business.
Yeah. Yeah. And, my take on this is that before you make exceptions in your program guidelines around what cadence of OKRs is right for each department or group, make sure people understand the reason why we're setting a regular cadence at all, right? And one of the key reasons for doing this is that the organization is doing planning, check-ins, and reflections at the same time, right? It's meaningful that we can go through this process together, right? And hitting those milestones in an aligned fashion, right? So if you have a group saying, our work is a much longer horizon than quarterly, it absolutely can't work. What you can challenge them to say is, look, we understand your projects tend to take longer than a quarter, but if we reframe the question and say, at the end of 90 days, when the organization comes together to reflect, what would be a measure of extreme success for you? And if you ask that question instead of how long do my projects take, quarterly might still be an appropriate cadence for that group that initially challenged it, right? An example I might give really quickly here is there are engineering teams, right? And they're working on, really short sprint cycles already. So they're thinking of quarterly as something that's not a perfect fit with the cadence of their work. But some of those engineering teams we've worked with have said, there is still purpose in us taking a step back from, our locked in sprint cycle where we're managing on a weekly or biweekly basis, taking a wider view and saying, what's the value we're delivering in relation to the organization? And in that way, some groups will say quarterly OKRs that represent a higher level theme than our sprints and our tasks is useful for the team. But I have seen some engineering groups that said, well, we'll set shorter term OKRs, maybe monthly, that match closer to our execution cycle, right? So I did want to make that point, which is I still like to challenge groups to make sure they understand where the quarterly cadence comes from before we make an exception for how long their OKR should be.
Yeah, I guess I would sort of add into that, maybe embellish the story. I tend to, as you know, use metaphors, read all the time. So I think of a watch.
Yeah.
Some gears move once a month, some move once a second.
Yeah.
Some move, and so those are like different departments. They have different cadences, but we agree in the organization that once a month or once a quarter, we're going to synchronize our watches. So even though your pace might be faster and your pace might be slower, let's synchronize once in a while. Now, I'll give you an example. We just finished doing, there's three great examples. So we did actually the first nuclear power plant in the UAE with their OKRs earlier this year. Well, when you build a nuclear power plant, a decade is pretty short term. Like you don't do stuff that quickly. We also did the Astute submarine program in the UK, right? 25,000 man years to make one sub. It takes a long time. You don't see a lot happening, but things are getting done every day, every week, every month, every quarter, even though the total enterprise of building a nuclear power plant or a nuclear attack submarine, it's like watching paint dry. There's still a whole bunch of activity that we need to make sure we get done this year, this quarter, this month, this day on that longer term.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, we're dealing with a major athletics company that were making running shoes about once every 17 seconds. So now you got one business where the cadence is incredibly fast and two, which are incredibly slow. Same framework of OKRs, but different cadence to their objectives and results.
Yeah. And, all of these examples we use of different decisions that different types of organizations need to make. I do want to just plug that this is why it's so important to spend time up front defining your program before you attempt to roll out organizational OKRs, right? So, taking time to thoroughly answer how OKRs are going to work, and that means cadence, that means ownership levels. That's a huge step you need to take before asking people to just, jump into the deep end, right? So I just want to call that out. So let me ask another question, which is, let's say you have different cadence guidelines for different parts of the organization. Do you ever see it useful, Brett, where one group owns two sets of OKRs, right? Maybe a set that is annual and a set that is quarterly, or representing a longer term and a shorter term horizon at the same time?
I would say in about 100% of the cases. So if I go back through my example of saying senior leadership looks longer term and it gets shorter as you go down, that senior leadership, depending on how they're looking at the organization, is going to have objectives that are their ones that they own that are annual, metaphorically. They're going to take a look at to get those done, what their VPs do quarterly, to get those done, what are we doing monthly, and so on. One of the tricks to OKRs, one of the reasons they're so powerful is giving that full transparency. So the leadership can drill all the way down. Now, that doesn't mean micromanaging, it's just micro monitoring. So I'm going to go through those timelines.
Yeah, well, maybe to clarify my question, Brett, not within the organization are there different cadences. What if you have top company OKRs that are annual, but they also want a set of top company OKRs, maybe owned by the executive team, that are quarterly as well? Or let's say you have an engineering group that has quarterly OKRs and wants to also have monthly OKRs. So my question is, same entity, same people trying to manage two sets at the same time.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it, my answer would still be 100% of the time. The issue is, first off, when you manage, I'm not always 100% of the time managing that 1 year goal or that 1 quarter goal, that 1 month. You kind of drill into the detail and then go back up. Now, Then it gets into a question of who owns what. So in that view, does the executive own it all, and how much visibility they need? So I'm going to call that above the radar and below the radar. So above the radar is the stuff that leadership needs to pay attention to. And in a crisis like COVID, a whole bunch of short-term O's or OKRs pop up above the radar. As we begin to get back to a steady state, those drift back down and get delegated or owned inside the organization. But that accordion I tried to describe is it moves up and down. To phrase it another way, if you find that your senior leadership is constantly looking at your OKRs, you should be paying close attention, because if they think that it's worth their time spending in that shorter cadence issue, then it means something is rickety in your part of the organization that they're trying to get their arms around. Now, if you read Elliot Jock's A Requisite Organization, he talks about the cognitive skill set needed by an executive. And his model, simply puts, is as you move up the organization, you need a higher cognitive skill set, Reed, because you've got to be playing with those multiple timelines simultaneously.
Yeah. So I agree with your example. I guess to one area where I disagree in just like the phrasing of it is if someone came to me and said, hey, I have a group that they look at our annual top company OKRs. They want to set some OKRs for themselves that are annual in nature, and also they're going to manage some quarterly OKRs. I would advise against that use case. So that's what I'm considering, 2 sets of OKRs at the same level. And the reason I would advise against that is because the whole point of creating this system is that it's repeatable, it's simple enough, and it brings focus and clarity to what's important now. And if we start introducing additional things that take up our mental bandwidth, and even if it's, even if it's annual OKRs that we're not going to check that often compared to our own quarterly OKRs, we have split our bandwidth, right? And if we want to promise this increased focus, we got to make sure that we're limiting how many things split up that bandwidth, right? And so I think you're right. It's the job of leadership to break this down, communicate the vision, and understand ownership at different levels. But once you get further down in the organization, it's easier if we say your sole responsibility is to keep focused on this one cadence, 90 days. And we're going to support you every 90 days. We're not going to ask you to manage these competing timeframes. And a big reason why this is also important, aside from just maintaining focus, is, again, if there is a shift organizationally in strategy and you have to now go and update OKRs throughout the organization, not just by level, but by timeframes within each level, this is just a complicated process that you shouldn't be asking, people throughout the organization to worry about. It really, I think, it sucks up bandwidth.
Yeah, so you're doing earlier on some stage setting about why we have these Wisdom Wednesdays. And one of the reasons that you and I chose this to be a fun thing to do is we don't necessarily agree on everything. And the idea here is, I always say rule number 1 of OKRs is there's no rule number 1. What's interesting about OKRs is there's no one defined thought leader. If you think of re-engineering, you think of Michael Hammer, you think of the balanced scorecard as Kaplan and Norton. John Doerr merely is the messenger that describes what's out there.
Sure.
And all of us as a community of practice are developing ideas that, become part of that best practice environment. But there's no rule that says you have to do it this way or that way. And so Absolutely. I think what's interesting about, Reed, how you and I talk is there's no one right answer. There's different perspectives. And I'm glad we get to surface them.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. But And I agree with that. What's interesting, though, is I do go back to the facts, focus, align, commit, track, stretch, as an interesting way to challenge whether or not we've broken too many rules, right? You're right. There's no one rule. But let's say we want everyone to own 30 OKRs. They're all private, right? And we don't require that people update progress for a couple years, right? I think we've broken too many rules, and it's not true to the facts anymore. So I would challenge that those are still quote unquote OKRs at that point. But I agree with you. I mean, there is no source of truth on this, right? Beyond what you've mentioned before, is this crowdsourced set of guidelines. One quick thing here, Brett. We had a follow up from the check engine light question to clarify the metaphor. And I want to take a stab at running with your metaphor because I do like this one. So the question was, so OKR is full engine and KPI is each of the data points to measure the engine. Let me try this, Brett, and then you can clarify.
Well, you got to ask that question a bit slower for the audience.
So the question is OKR in this metaphor the full engine and KPI is each of the data points to measure the engine? So answering as you, Brett, because I think I understand how you describe this. The objective, right? The objective is your strategy where you want to go. So it's the trip, right? So I'm driving from my house to the hospital, right? Because my wife's in labor. That's the objective that we need to understand before we react to a key result or a KPI that says the check engine light is on, right? Because in that scenario, the objective lets me know if that check engine light comes on, that's important to fix, but not right now because our goal is to get to the hospital. If our objective, let's say, is just daily driving to and from work, and that engine light comes on, let's stop. Let's get the car towed because we don't want to risk this for the long term. Is that a good way to represent objective, key result, and difference between OKR and KPI?
Absolutely. And as you know, I always extend the story. So I say, and furthermore, by the way, I know that you've got a freshly minted daughter. I hope the check engine light didn't go on for you when.
No, luckily.
So you'd actually have different key results. So let's say one scenario, my objective is to go for a pleasant drive in the country. Well, then, I'm going to have KRs about, am I on highways or not? Because I probably don't want to be on a highway. Is it, a scenic area, that kind of stuff. Whereas if my strategy is, again, driving to work, it might be the lowest time or, what route has the most Starbucks en route or whatever that might be. So as you say, once you understand the objective, the key results might end up shifting a bit. Obviously, now it's your hospital scenario, the check engine light doesn't even show up. It's irrelevant data that isn't going to influence any decision. So I don't even want it on the dashboard. And our dashboards are good metaphors to use because we spend a lot of time engineering them. That key result, that KPI goes away, right? When you look at your dashboard, if everything's fine, you don't see that key result. The only things that pop up on the dashboard are things that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I do like that analogy. Okay, so I know you added some questions that you might want to discuss, Brett. Is there anything you want to shift this conversation towards right now, or should we return to the COVID scenario? How to manage OKRs in crisis?
Well, I do see we've got one other question that we skipped over, that first one that says, for the last example, which now is way back when, if you know you already have a strained resource, what would the tripwire be? And so the answer to that would be, it depends on the strained resource. So in the example, if the strained resource might be financial budget, you'd better set some tripwires that will give you some lead time that are financial indicators. And now the lead time there is the time between when the indicator triggers and your mitigation strategy kicks in. So if to solve that cash flow problem, you have to get a loan and that takes you a month, I better have a key result that gives me a month and a day's lead time so that when that triggers, I can solve the problem before it becomes a crisis. Now, if the constrained resource in your scenario is IT capacity, same thing. How long does it take us to, subcontract IT resources or outsource or hire new people? Then I can reverse engineer what key result I might need to give me sufficient lead time. Now, the problem here is the longer lead time you need, the lower the signal strength of the key result. In other words, if I'm concerned about my kid getting an A in math, I could wait till I get the report card, but the problem is that doesn't give me enough time to fix it. So I could take a look at their test Now that doesn't tell me exactly how much they know, but it's better. If I need more lead time, I could take a look at, are they participating in class? Again, the signal strength of that key result's getting weaker and weaker, but it's buying me more lead time for the mitigation strategy. So back up to the question. So if you're in a resource constrained world, you got to figure out what is the resource and put more key results around that. And the key result gives you enough lead time to react.
Yeah, I do want to make one comment on this idea of resource planning and how it relates to OKRs. That I do see that as a trouble area where you start thinking of OKRs as the way you really can resource plan for a certain time frame. And one reason why is because, you know, a quote I'll go back to quite often from John Doerr is, OKRs are not the sum total of work that's taking place within your organization, right? So to get us to a point where OKRs are meaningfully focused and highlighting the most important work, we actually have to omit a lot of effort from the OKRs that are represented in our org. Now, some organizations will lean closer to OKRs representing a fuller breadth of work. But a lot of organizations really wanting to achieve focus and alignment will say, OKRs are just the most important things. In that world, you can't rely on what's defined as OKRs as equaling, 100% of effort in your organization. Therefore, we use them as the map for hiring resources, allocating resources for a certain time frame. They can be a useful data point going into that discussion. But again, looking at how your program is set up, and if that's true in your organization, don't rely on them as the only mechanism for resource planning.
Yeah, I think we've had this conversation before, but it's always a good horse to start flogging a bit more. Rule number one, no rule number one. I'm on the other side of Reed as saying my bias is towards making sure your OKRs cover 80 or 90% of the activities that go on. Now, that doesn't mean 80% of your OKRs are run the business, but I got to make sure I got my finger on the pulse. Because if I don't, it now means I got to run two systems. One that's tracking the run the business daily activities, and the other, the OKR system, that's looking at the change. And Reed, earlier on, you talked about some of the disconnect that happens if I'm trying to run multiple OKRs with long timelines and short timelines. It's the same problem. If I'm running one system that runs the business and a different system to change the business, how do I make sure they work together? And if the change the business or the run the business is going in the dumpster, if they're two separate systems, I might still be wasting resources on projects I should be killing. Anyways, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just saying that's some of the other texture that some of our listeners might be experiencing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And one way to frame it too is where on your journey towards OKRs are you going? Sometimes you might start very far on one end of the spectrum and it's all run the business activity, knowing that you want to get to a point where you're setting more and more aspirational OKRs that solve upstream problems, right? And it might be a transition over quarters or years in your program, and then where you end up on that on those goalposts. So, Brett, I want to see, is there any other question you want to dive into?
You said before, should we go back to COVID, which kind of implied you thought there's a little bit more, and I think that there is. One of the issues with COVID is last January, or this time last year, no one imagined 2020 was going to turn out like it did.
Right.
And so what OKRs are trying to do is help us grapple with not only what I said before, the pace of business is changing, but there's also levels of uncertainty like there never was before. Like, there's a lot of news about the 1913, pandemic. Well, we didn't have the information systems and the communication networks that we have now. And so we didn't have these knee-jerk reactions or these aggressive correctional items, both at the public sector and private sector level. And so now the question is, given the realities of the unexpected events like COVID, what does that mean for us? And I'm going to ask you this question, Reed. What does that mean for us in terms of the cadence of OKRs in 2021? What should we do when we come up with COVID-21, God forbid?
Well, so I had this thought. I described very briefly what we saw, February, March, April, which was that organizations said we're reacting to this momentous event, and the health of our business depends on what we do in the next few weeks or months. So our planning cadence and our communication cadence around OKRs might have to be shortened. So organizations that relied on longer term OKRs were looking at quarterly, and then organizations that use quarterly OKRs were looking at monthly or even more frequent. But I think what we've seen obviously is that organizations that have weathered the storm, and now they're looking at managing business in a new environment, right? Remote, dispersed work. And maybe the response is to COVID not as an existential event, but as a challenge to maintaining and keeping an organization inspired and motivated in this environment, right? And so something that I think is really interesting is looking at some of the work Josh Burson is doing, and the analysis of how people are responding to all of these impacts on their personal life at the same time as their business life, and trying to stay engaged and motivated in an organization. And I think that a lot of what we're learning, Burson brought up this idea of doubling down on purpose. People having a sense of purpose is such an important part of keeping them engaged in an organization and producing at a high level. And OKRs, when done well, really value how we're taking organizational strategy and initiatives and translating that using inspiring language into a set of OKRs that reflect the purpose of an organization. They're not just focused on projects and tasks. It's bringing our purpose to life. So in some sense, you don't have to change anything about the classic understanding of OKRs to help drive purpose in an organization, but it's more and more important to companies who are managing a remote workforce, for one thing. The second thing I did read about too was that I think people, when rotating last year to set shorter term OKRs and check into them more, they probably saw not a better response from the organization towards, a better response to how much people enjoyed that process. And what I mean by that is doubling down on, those check-ins and the communication. That might feel better from a management perspective. Hey, I have more visibility into what people are working on, but the organization suffered, right? They're feeling the stress of people looking over their shoulders, asking them what's happening right now. And so there was an interesting article that said that what we've learned from remote work is that asynchronous work, where you can be responding to a message any time of day, at the dinner table, you're expected to be online almost at any moment. That's very stressful and does not lead to greater productivity, right? That interrupts this time that you should be spent with really valuable work. So when OKRs are done well in a quarterly cadence, you respect that people are not communicating every activity or task they're working on, but checking in maybe every 2 weeks, talking about progress. We're not micromanaging, but we're just respecting that person's contribution to something that matters, the OKR, right? So getting away from more and more activity tracking is something I think we have to respond to, because everyone over-rotated to that going into this remote work environment. And OKRs are meant to keep the conversation high level. Let's keep it on what's important right now. So that was getting deep into a lot of articles. But Brett, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, two things. One is because I like flogging dead horses. I really agree with that idea of helping people link to purpose, and I truly, and I love Daniel Pink's work on intrinsic motivators.
For sure.
And I like that concept of doubling down on purpose. But the dead horse I'm flogging here is that means as people define their OKRs, if people define their purpose in the organization, it has to cover the run the business component as well as the change the business. Otherwise, their purpose is only defined by those projects or the strategic initiatives that they're working on. And the other 80% of their lives is ignored and therefore, lacks in that purpose. But I agree, dead horse.
Okay.
Uh, the
Yeah.
the thing I was thinking about while you're talking, and it kind of reflects on an earlier point you made. An earlier point you made is when we're setting up OKRs, we should consider what is the cadence or drumbeat that's needed. Reed, who do you think it is in the organization that makes that call? Whether it should be a monthly cadence or quarterly cadence, or where's that decision come from?
So I think there is a decision that comes from the top, and it has to be the cadence that your CEO or whoever the highest level executive sponsor of your OKR program is willing to vouch for and continually support. I've thought of this sometimes as almost like a federalist system, where what we're asking organizationally often is there is a set of really broad strokes everyone needs to follow, right? So if by nothing else, I want everyone to update progress and have a meaningful conversation every quarter. That might be the thing that your CEO endorses organizationally, but there's room within, those rules for parts of the organization to set more specific or restrictive rules, right? And so if we went from no process at all and half participation in annual goals to 95% participation in quarterly goals, which is just bare minimum, then that's a huge step forward for alignment and transparency in a company, right? So that's the federal government, your CEO signing off on those laws. But that's not to say that if you are a team that wants to have weekly stand-ups and discuss your OKRs, you shouldn't make that the hard and strict rule within that team, right? That's absolutely allowed at the state level and at the city level, right? So I do think you need to have the buy-in of your executive sponsor, obviously, for this to work, to make sure that organizationally people believe in OKRs, but it doesn't have to mean that that person is making every rule for every person in every team, right? They're just creating, the constitution for the company.
Yeah, interesting. I like the metaphor. Another thing that came to mind as we talked about this is, okay, so now in your example, we've agreed on this quarterly cadence, even though I got that longer annual overall goal. Should we be able to, I don't know, press a button to roll forward this period OKRs into next period? Like that should be just an automated thing. Or should we stop and think and then like literally re-enter them in the tool for the next quarter?
Well, we have that button in BetterWorks to literally clone it. I know that wasn't your question. But yeah, the point of that is, majority of cases, let's say you have an OKR that you want to take into the next quarter. Oftentimes, it's not like you have an untouched OKR. It's maybe 40% complete, but you realize that the remaining 60% should still be a focus. So rolling that into the next quarter should require you asking yourself, what are the new measures of success for completing this? Because we're 40% of the way there, essentially. And does this require a change of focus at the objective level, right? Maybe before we said, deliver this amazing customer experience. We've already delivered the platform, so now it's just putting into practice, like through educating our service reps. So maybe we rephrase it as such, but it still represents the remaining work that we set out to do. So I think it almost always requires a little bit of translation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Strategy is a continuous process, and we need to make sure that our conversation today about cadence doesn't get in the way of business doing what business needs to do, right? That accordion
Yeah.
metaphor. We need a way to make sure that it can reflect the realities of any business. And again, each business is going to decide whether it's that button you described or it's a process of reviewing.
Yeah.
For sure.
I do see a question came in through the Q&A. So it's, if there is a role dedicated to OKR implementation at an organization, how can they best be effective? Do you want me to start on this, Brett, or do you want to?
Sure, go for it. I mean, I've got my list of answers.
Yeah, so when we partner with an organization, we try to define who makes sense as a program lead. And the program lead is going to be most successful if they have a partner in this implementation who is the executive sponsor, right? So while the program lead is dedicated to the OKR implementation and ongoing management of the program, the executive sponsor is someone who can be the public advocate and make sure that the train stays on the tracks. And so having the executive sponsor on board and committed is the number one most important step. The two other things I would call out as foundational needs for that role being successful is you go through that process of program design, right? You build out a set of guidelines and expectations, answering, for example, the question we've been debating this morning, and having that crystal clear and laid out for the organization. So this is how we set OKRs, this is when we set OKRs, and this is why we set OKRs. Those questions being answered in crystal clear for the organization. And then lastly, we have this idea of cadence for OKR setting. You should have a cadence for program management and review. And that includes maybe a quarterly discussion with that executive sponsor and some other stakeholders about what areas of the program are seeing great success and what areas could be improved, right? So a really important element of BetterWorks, having software that manages your OKRs, is you can see engagement across different parts of the OKR process. And you could say, hey, we're having really strong engagement at the start of the quarter and less at the end of the quarter. Maybe we need to build in some area of the program that reinforces our reflection process at quarter end, right? So being able to manage that and having that cadence of program review and discussion with your sponsors is really important.
Yeah, I guess what I would chip in there is OKR implementation project management is really no different than any other project. So take all the stuff that we talked about, which is basically the same for any other project, sponsors and charters and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, roll that forward. I would say the two unique things about OKR implementations are this. Thing one is we always present it as not big change. In other words, it's just leveling up what exists already. The organization already has a strategy. We're just making it clearer. The organization already does activities. We're just defining those and being clear about who does what. The organization already has, annual performance reviews. We're just giving you better content. The organization already works cross-functionally. We're just making that explicit. So it's not change. It's just common sense 101. In fact, most of our work gets done in a week, not because we're brilliant, but because all the answers are already there. We're just joining the existing strategy with the existing process knowledge, with existing data, and putting it into a connected system. So thing number one is it's not big change. So don't make it look like it is. You just scare people. It's really just leveling up what's there already. In fact, many of our clients can implement OKRs with never telling the organization they're implementing OKRs because it looks like just the ongoing continuous improvement. The second part,
go ahead.
The second part, which is different than how to become more effective. What we do know is that project leader person in 100% of our clients always gets promoted. And the reason is because you have to lead by influence. You're going to be going cross-functional and you can be guiding them on OKR implementation. You're going to be answering their tough questions, surfacing their key activities, help them find those key results. Now, if any of those leaders are looking for support, they think of you because you've been in that trusted advisor role. So it's not directly answering your question, but the benefit of taking on this job is because of all that mechanism and how strategic the work is you're doing, inevitably it's a step up the ladder for you.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was.
Hey, Brett, I had this thought when you said, it's not big change, where, one big step we like to take in program design is talk about the program vision. And it's basically telling an organization, why are we implementing OKRs? Can you explain it in terms that doesn't use the letters O or KR?
Yeah.
And the idea there is to say, maybe you have extensive employee satisfaction or engagement surveys that say, we have a real problem with alignment or transparency in this company, right? That's something that everyone has acknowledged exists. So what we're introducing is not this big scary thing called OKR. What we're introducing is, a solution to our transparency issue or our alignment struggles. And when you just take that simple step, I think you can win over hearts and minds a lot easier,
right,
and a lot faster.
Yeah, my favorite slide recently with OKRs is that, that proverb about the 8 blind people and the elephant, right? Depending what part of the elephant you're hanging on to, it looks like something different.
Right.
I think OKRs is the same, right? So yeah, you described an HR element about employee engagement and stuff, but a different part of the elephant is sales. That's trying to get sales aligned with marketing and aligned with operations so that we're working smoothly cross-functionally.
Mm-hmm.
A different part is senior leadership that's trying to get people clear on what the strategy and strategic priorities are. A different part of the elephant is the call center that's trying to get better alignment between what the customers need and what's being provided in the help screens. And so OKRs are a multifaceted tool that are really our strategy execution. And so to embellish your story, as you talk about the benefits, understand that as you describe it to your teams, many people are going to see the benefits in a different light based on where they're at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you can obviously have a vision statement that acknowledges all the values you expect to see from OKRs, but that's a great point. Yeah, so being conscious of time, I do want to start wrapping things up. So Brett, thank you so much for your time and your debate. I'm glad we disagreed on some things. That's the whole point of this. We can't be in lockstep here. And thank you everyone who asked a question. We're going to do these Wisdom Wednesdays regularly, so please join in the future and bring your questions. We can spend the whole session just responding to questions as opposed to our discussion that's somewhat prepared. So we would love to see you in further Wisdom Wednesdays. As a reminder, if you have questions about BetterWorks and our solution, please send us a note. So if you are interested in seeing how our platform can help support an OKR implementation or program, please reach out and follow up. And we do want to leave with a message of just saying happy holidays. I hope everyone stays safe and has a really nice end of the year here as we go into 2021.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed being here.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. All right. One last question. Is it the same link each Wisdom Wednesday? No, it'll be different. So just be on the lookout on our website as we schedule and share those. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.